Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President. So I want to just stop and just imagine something for a moment, and imagine if you're a service funded by the government and that you've been put on notice since the election, and that was in September 2013, that you've been put on notice that your budget is going to be cut, but you've got to wait until budget night 2015 to find out what that funding cut looks like. And you don't know, you have been put on notice, but you don't know how much you're going to lose. You have no idea whether you'll be asked to cut back on particular services or provide services in a particular area, or just, in fact, whether you'll be told how services are to be delivered. Well, that's what the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, the Prime Minister of our country, has said to Aboriginal Legal Services right across the country. Cuts are coming. They're going to come on budget night 2015, but between now and then we're not going to tell you how much or what will happen to your services. And I want to focus particularly on the Aboriginal Legal Service in Western Australia. It's a fine organisation, doesn't get any money like most Aboriginal services, gets no funding at all from the state. It is entirely dependent upon the Commonwealth Government for its funding. And we know in Western Australia, and indeed this statistic is borne out across the country, that there are very high rates of incarceration of Aboriginal people in this country, way too high. And in Western Australia, we have one of the highest incarceration rates of Aboriginal people in the country. So that tells me, and it should tell other senators, that the work of the Aboriginal Legal Service in Western Australia is critical. Not only that, Western Australia, of course, is vast, and the Aboriginal Legal Service provides services throughout Western Australia. From a very small budget, that's what it manages to do, to provide a unique service, a culturally appropriate service, and a service which itself employs a lot of Aboriginal people, to those Aboriginal people who find themselves charged with a crime on a daily basis. I want to paint a picture of the Aboriginal Legal Service in Western Australia, and in just one small part in the northwest. And the Aboriginal Legal Services have been around for 40 years in Western Australia, doing a fine job. And certainly it's the view of those Aboriginal Legal Services officers that in WA in particular, without the ALS, if they were to disappear, if the Aboriginal Legal Service was to lose so much funding it could no longer represent persons charged with offences, the criminal justice system in Western Australia in particular would collapse. Because ALS, as I just said, provides those services across the length and breadth of Western Australia. And for those senators who are not Western Australians, that's a landmass greater than Western Europe. But unlike Western Europe, it's not, it doesn't have good transport links, and most travel is done by road and in some areas by air, but mostly by road. So in Broome, the ALS has 3 lawyers and a court officer. Now, the court officers tend to be Aboriginal people, and they have a right of appearance in WA court. And their circuits cover Broome, Derby, Fitzroy Crossing in particular. And on any day that the circuit is operating, between 70 and 95% of the clients on the court list are clients of the Aboriginal Legal Service. Now, what does that look like? You know, we can all trick people with stats, but the court lists between those 3 towns vary between 45 and 120 people every circuit, and most of those, in fact almost all of them, are clients of the ALS. And in some places where the circuit spills into another day simply because of the caseload, legal aid, because they too have had cuts and will suffer cuts into the future, are not there. They can't, the legal aid service in Western Australia can't manage that second day, so the ALS does the whole list. The Aboriginal Legal Service does that whole list. And of course, the ALS in Broome also does remote courts to Aboriginal communities of Bidjikdanga, Dampier Peninsula and Luma. Long distances to drive. So in addition to doing their legal work representing most of the clients before the courts, they then drive distances of 120 kilometres, 200 kilometres to represent their clients. And that pattern is not unique to Broome. It is not unique to Broome. In fact, that pattern is represented across the state. And of course, the ALS does the full spectrum of legal work, from the most serious criminal matters to minor offences. And all of that work is done on very limited resources, and all of that work is being done under the threat of future cuts, but we don't know how much and we don't know how they will be applied. All by a government who purports to be aiming to do its very best by Aboriginal people in this country. When they do something of the magnitude that's being done to the Aboriginal Legal Service, you could not say they are doing their best by any stretch of the imagination. And of course, in Western Australia, no thought is being given to the remoteness of the kind of communities that the ALS attend to, or the travelling distances. They've just been told to expect a cut. And I spoke to the Aboriginal Legal Service this afternoon to ask them, to check me out that I had all of my facts correct. Because when I last spoke to the Aboriginal Legal Service, and this was in evidence to the Select Committee on Abbott's Commission of Audit, they told me at that time that they had 12 serious cases, so they had 12 people facing charges of murder. And under Labor, and this goes back a very, very long time, there was a fund that the Attorney-General administered called the Expensive Case Fund, which obviously murder cases are. They're complex. People have the right to be represented. They're complex cases, and they would submit a submission to the Attorney-General's office to receive this additional funding to support them with these very serious charges. Well, they now have, the ALS now have 14 murder charges, and no funds, because that funding has completely dried up. So the Abbott government is expecting the Aboriginal Legal Service in Western Australia, and I'm sure this is no different to other Aboriginal legal services across the country, to somehow fund that very complex, serious cases through their current funding, which they are not funded to do. So they don't know how they are going to brief council. They don't know where that money is going to come from. But what they are very determined about is that Aboriginal people are, of course, entitled to the same access to justice and defence than any other non-Aboriginal person. But that's not what's happening at the moment, because this particular expensive case funding under the Attorney-General's has dried up. The Abbott government has not seen fit to put any additional funds in there, and yet we have the Aboriginal Legal Service in WA expected nevertheless to provide good representation, as it does, to Aboriginal people facing very, very serious charges without any funds. And of course, we've heard over and over that cuts to Aboriginal legal services would not affect frontline services, but they are a frontline agency. There's no getting away from that. There is no getting away from the fact that the ALS are in the front line. They're in our court systems. They're out in Aboriginal communities. And so what I would urge the Abbott government to do is, between now and the budget next year, is to get your act together and give some assurance to the ALSs across this country that they will not be cut. This is not fair and it's got to stop, and the ALS must have some confidence in their ability to represent people into the future. Thank you, Mr Deputy Acting President.